I suppose good afternoon, good morning. It's currently 1:30 for me here in Australia, so please apologise if I'm a little bit out of it. But I'm going to be spending the next 10 minutes or so kind of talking a little bit about different array architectures. So summarising mainly life papers 4 and 7 with a few kind of open-ended questions at the end. So if you want to learn more, feel free to read these papers or send me an email. I'm happy to chat about it. But I'll get into it. So since the Darwin TPF days, most of the discussions that we currently have about the configuration of a life-type mission is mainly this so-called X-array, which is basically 4 telescopes in a rectangular formation where you impose certain phase shifts between each of the collector spacecraft, and you produce a map that looks like this. So 2 superimposed sinusoidal patterns. And so if you had a planet, it would kind of effectively do a loop around that map, producing a signal that you can then extract via template matching or something like that. However, since the Darwin and TPF days, there have been a couple more studies that have come out to kind of look into maybe there are some other ways that we can do this. And one such is the prospect of kernel nulling, developed by Franz Martin-Asch and Mike Ireland, where it's more or less using linear combinations of different outputs that your beam combiner might produce that are inherently resistant to residual wavefront errors. You can think of this like phase chopping in the traditional double Bracewell design, but you can extend this more generally with pretty much any number of telescopes. And it's more or less defined by a single matrix. So you can do this via linear algebra. So what I did is I created a small little simulation of a couple different architectures, just to kind of get a bit of a feel for what different architectures might do in finding terrestrial-like planets. So the ones I considered, there's a triangular type pattern, and as you can see the transmission maps on the right. We considered a kite-based 4 telescope pattern, mainly because this type of kernel nulling approach works best by having non-redundant baselines, whereas the X-array has redundant baselines, and so we weren't able to utilize that symmetry. And then finally, we used a 5 telescope array in a pentagonal formation, producing very, very pretty transmission maps that look good on a paper. So we ran some photon noise only, I have to emphasize that, Monte Carlo simulations, assuming no instrumental noise, some fairly basic assumptions, fairly similar to those in life papers 1 and 2, but a little bit different. And we compared the different architectures. And as you can see, the X-array performs really well. Like, there's a reason that it was chosen to begin with. However, the 5 telescope design does slightly edge it out, both in terms of total planets detected and temperate rocky planets. Not by a huge amount, but by a little bit. And the main reason for this you can see in this plot here. So these are 2 planets that we simulated. One was a super Earth type planet around an M dwarf and a Neptune around a K dwarf. And as you can see, notably comparing the gold and green lines compared to the dark blue one. And what you can see is that particularly at shorter wavelengths, the 5 telescope design does a lot better. And this comes from the fact that 5 telescope design has what we call a 4th order null. That is more or less, it is much better at doing starlight suppression. You don't get as much stellar leakage, which is mainly the problem at those shorter wavelengths, and so we get a much better signal to noise. Now, of course, this is assuming that we care about every point in this wavelength range. Of course, certain wavelengths will be more important for certain atmospheric lines, and so this hasn't been matched with template matching against spectra, so there are some questions up in the air about that. But we thought it was worth considering this 5 telescope design a little bit further. And mainly the question, how on earth do you actually implement something like this? With a 4 telescope design, you can kind of build it with pairs of two-way couplers. But how do you create a telescope beam combiner that basically performs the function of this complex matrix here? And the answer is something potentially like this. which is a set of cascading beam splitters and phase shifters based off of the work of Guillaume in 2013. And so what this is basically you need to have a set of beam splitters and phase shifters with fairly precise reflectance coefficients and phase shifts that more or less mix the light in such a way that you get this lovely output at the end. However, I should note the first layer of optics here performs the nulling. That's all done at the very beginning, and all of the rest of the more complicated beam splitters are just doing this mixing in order to give us outputs that when you take the difference between them, you get the phase errors cancel out, so to say. Now, when we were looking at this design, we stumbled upon something that's kind of cool. And that is that one of your telescopes can actually be, I don't know, hit with a meteorite or something like that, go down, and you're still able to have it function as a kernel nulling beam combiner. More or less, you can, maybe if you have enough fuel, move your telescopes into a rectangle, and suddenly you have an X-ray again. We ran some calculations. You have a reduced signal to noise, of course, because this is not an optimized setup anymore. However, it will still function. This is different to the traditional X-ray type configuration, where if you lose a telescope, suddenly your use of this interferometer for exoplanets is lost because you can't really get those differential nulls anymore. You still might be able to do some other science, but you really lose that exoplanet flavor. However, if you can design the X-ray in a similar way to this, with a lot of beam splitters, and you retain that same property. So that was just kind of an interesting side effect that we stumbled upon. We also, though, started looking at instrumental errors, which is kind of probably going to be a big topic that the instrumentation and technology team are going to be bringing up over the next 2 days. And notably, instrumental errors are worse in the shorter wavelengths. That's kind of the take-home message. So what we did here is we kind of compared with each of these beam splitters and phase shifts. Inherently, you're going to have some optical defects. You're not going to get that precise phase shift or that precise reflectivity. And so if they were off by a certain amount, how would that affect our null? How would that affect our background leakage? And so in these plots, as you can see, the worse it gets, the more that leakage starts to become a problem, particularly at these very short wavelengths. But notably, it does not change the total amount of nulled light. So actually, as your error increases, this top line here, which is the second order null, which is the slightly worse one, actually gets better. So it's kind of conserving total light, but basically your mixing is no longer perfect, and so you get some errors out there. We also had a bit of a look at fringe tracking errors, so that is making sure the paths are exactly right, and inherently there's going to be some jitter there. And they are also very much wavelength dependent and worse at the shorter wavelengths. This stems from the fact that at the shorter wavelengths, you're dealing with more stellar leakage because for particularly solar type stars, there's a lot more flux there. And so the fringe tracking requirement is more stringent. And as you can see, generally we're requiring fringe tracking on the order of about a nanometer or so, particularly if we're looking for solar type stars. That being said, there are also challenges on the other end of the spectrum, particularly Sasha brought it up at during his talk, but mid-infrared photonics. It's both a kind of a great opportunity in building combiners, kind of like some of the ones that I just mentioned, but it might also be somewhat of a requirement to spatially filter the light to remove, in order to get that pure mode, and whether or not we can have mature spatial filters, even if it's not a fully photonic component. This is another technology area that we kind of need to push for. So I'll finish off with less of a summary and more of just some open questions and work that I've been considering a little bit. I haven't really gotten far on many of these things, but One is kind of getting a systematic approach to comparing instrumental noise between all these different architectures. And I know that Felix and Romer and Philip and a bunch of others are also kind of thinking about this problem. There's a context of information. So you might have noticed that very pretty 5 telescope design has a lot of structure in it, and whether we can utilize that structure in order to better distinguish between complex planetary scenes, or even to be able to utilize that information to reduce the amount of modulation required. So maybe we don't need to spin the entire array, but we can use that information to rotate it slightly, greatly saving on fuel and mission cost. How does the optical design of the collectors change with the architecture? And then ultimately, the question that really needs to be answered at some point, do the estimated benefits of having 5 telescopes or some other array configuration overcome the associated costs compared to the kind of the default one that we've been assuming for the past couple of years or so? So yeah, that's all I've got to say. Happy to take some questions, and if not, happy to take things offline as well.
Thank you very much, Jonah. Excellent and perfectly on time. So are there questions?